All right, here's our next video on the Pacific battles of World War II because we talked about in our last video how it was multiple fronts and multiple places. I know the last one was a long video, so I'm going to do my best to make sure that this one is a shorter video and do the best I can there. I know some people are really into this, some people not. Either way, it's still a massive part of world history. Um, so the Pacific theater of World War II all begins when the U.S. enters the war on December 7th, 1941, because of Pearl Harbor. So Pearl Harbor was a major U.S. naval base on the state of Hawaii. Japan attacks bombs Pearl Harbor, a kind of a sneak attack. They bomb early in the morning one day when all signs were pointing. Well, there was some signs pointing to the fact that they knew about it, but um, it was kind of a down day for the people on the base, and they want to cripple the U.S. and hurt their naval fleet, but also they believe that they will prevent the U.S. from, if they bomb them, it will prevent the U.S. from getting in the way of Japan's goals. Okay, to conquer. Basically, Japan wants to conquer the entire Pacific Ocean and all of the islands there, and so they believe that if they bomb this island, the United States will have to rebuild it, and they will not be able to stop them from conquering the Pacific. Okay, 3,500 casualties, U.S. casualties on that day, and then major losses in the naval fleet. They had a couple ships be sunk, and lots of planes lost, and damage to the base and things like that. Um, and the next day, the U.S. enters World War II. So December 8th, 1941, they actually enter the war fighting. Okay, so this area here, whoops, yeah, this area here is Hawaii. So you can see Hawaii is a U.S. state, but it's a lot farther from the United States than people think. It's kind of it's not quite in the middle, but it's far from the U.S. And so Japan thought if they could attack that the U.S. would have to spend a lot of time there. Okay, um, so we got that, which is good. I don't. There we go. So here's some pictures of Pearl Harbor because I've been there and it was really really cool. So you can see a picture of actually sinking of the aircraft, but this is the size of one of the ships that was sunk. So you can kind of think of how major the event really was. This is a observation deck, but underneath this is a ship that is still in the harbor. They weren't able to, it sunk and they weren't able to get it out. So it is sitting there still leaking oil from Pearl Harbor. Okay. And then when we were there, we actually got to meet one of the two surviving people that were on Pearl Harbor at that day. And the stories he had were incredible. And the things he went through were incredible. And you can watch. There's a movie Pearl Harbor that's really good. It's kind of a love story. It's not as much a movie about the war, but it's extremely good and will show you some of the events of Pearl Harbor. But this attack, the United States takes this very pridefully and is very very upset about it, and so they declare war, and now we're officially in the war. Okay, and after Pearl Harbor, the strategy in the Pacific is what's called island hopping. So both Japan and the United States are going to go from, you can kind of see this blue line and this blue line. They're going to go from island to island and get victories on different islands: Midway, Saipan, Guam, even Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and go from island to island, because if they can control those islands, they'll push the Japanese back. And if Japan control those islands, they'll push the United States back. So that's kind of the strategy of what they do there. Okay. So the first major battle in the Pacific is the Battle of Midway in 1942. It takes place. It's a crucial U.S. island because of how close it is to Pearl Harbor, and if Japan controls the Midway, and while the United States is trying to rebuild Pearl Harbor, they'll be nervous that there's going to be another attack on Pearl Harbor. It houses a major naval fleet. And Japan thought that if they captured it, they would end the U.S. naval power in the Pacific. So if they bombed Pearl Harbor, then captured Midway, they'd really, really hurt them. But the U.S. wins, and it's a crucial victory in the turning point of the war in the Pacific. The U.S. really needs that victory, and they're able to get it. So you can see just how close Midway is to Pearl Harbor, and so they need that, or else they might launch an invasion of the United States. They might launch an invasion of Pearl Harbor. You just don't know. Okay. Next, we've got Guadalcanal, which is just down here. I'm sorry, the cursor wasn't working there. Just down here, Guadalcanal. And another major battle happens in late 1942. Japan was making a base on this island, and the United States is able to go there and as they're kind of working on it, kick them out. And again, Japan has to move backwards. So now the United States has two major victories in the Pacific, one at Midway, one at Guadalcanal, and they're able to push the Japanese back even further, which is huge. Okay, Battle of Iwo Jima is next, but not until 1945. So there is a little bit of a, the U.S. is during 1943 and 44 and 45, or really 44. They're focused all their attention on D-Day and Western Europe. So there's not a ton of fighting in the Pacific, but there is some in Saipan and Tarawa and things like that. But really, the next major battle is Iwo Jima, which is right here, so you can see exactly how close it is to Japan. And Iwo Jima was really important. So because they need this, because if they can get here, that's really close for them to be able to launch an invasion of Japan, and be able to force Japan to surrender and stop the war. Between these two islands, Okinawa and Iwo Jima, we'll talk about Okinawa next. These are the two most brutal examples of fighting in the Pacific, and you'll get a chance to look at that in one of the videos. But it's definitely the most brutal fighting of the war is in the Pacific. There, the U.S. wins, and again, now their island is near Japan, the country, so they can hopefully launch an attack here pretty soon. Okay. This is Iwo Jima, this famous photograph of the soldiers hoisting the flag at Iwo Jima. If you went to D.C., I'm sure that you've seen that picture if you went on the 8th grade trip or if you've been there in general. But these pictures just show some of the brutal fighting on Iwo Jima. And it's basically one massive like volcano mountain. And so they had to constantly try and fight up the mountain. And they finally got to the top, and they were so exhausted from the fighting that this kind of became an iconic photograph in world history, for that matter. Okay, so next we've got the Battle of Okinawa. Takes place after Iwo Jima in 1945. It's only 350 miles from Japan. So just like Iwo Jima, if they could control Okinawa as well, now they have two islands where they can launch an attack on Japan. Okay. And again, like I said, with Iwo Jima, these two islands are far and away the most brutal fighting of the war. The Japanese on Okinawa, they kind of realize that if they lose this, they're going to be hurting really bad. So they fight to the death, meaning that they will not surrender. The United States basically has to kill every Japanese soldier. They're not going to surrender. They use kamikaze pilots, which are suicide bombers, and they kind of come out of nowhere again. So it's brutal for the Americans that are there. There's 100,000 plus Japanese casualties, 65,000 plus U.S. casualties. So just in this one battle, so again, pretty massive amounts of casualties there. As you can see, Okinawa is right here. Okay, and this is really important for world history for the United States because it kind of shows that they're a power and they're not going to be messed with, but it also stops Japan from conquering more of the Pacific. So next, after Okinawa, there's a decision to be made. Okay, whether to invade Japan, whether the United States should invade Japan, or whether they should look to some other means in order to accomplish their goals. So what goes into this the decision is the fact that Japan was not going to surrender. That's just not what their culture believed in, and President Truman takes over for FDR because FDR died, and President Truman has to ask himself how many more American lives does he want to lose? Right, we've got 65,000 casualties in just the one last battle. How many more lives does he want to lose? And that really weighs on him. He has to put American troops into battle, and he has to put people on the lines, and so he really has to think about how many more lives he wants to lose. And if he used the atomic bomb, this would basically end the war. So that's exactly what he decides. He decides to use the atomic bomb that they had been testing at within the United States, and he drops them on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And on that day, 180,000 Japanese citizens died on Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki was a few days later, but 100,000 people died there, and and thousands more will die from the effects of the atomic bomb. The radiation causes cancer and other diseases. So thousands more will die because of this. But it did force Japan to surrender on August 15th, 1945. So it's a very controversial decision that was made. But President Truman felt that it was the best to save the lives of the Americans and also get the Japanese to surrender. So Hiroshima is right down here. Nagasaki is up over here. Okay, so you can kind of see exactly where they're at right there. The two mushroom clouds there. Okay. Um, this is the devastation that the atomic bomb caused. You can see all the just with the drop of the one bomb, you can see all the buildings there and what's left of it on the right. So it's extremely devastating, and does a lot of damage. All right, so to review the Pacific fighting, the Japanese dominates early with their surprise attacks at Pearl Harbor and to some extent Midway. But after Pearl Harbor, it's really a sign of U.S. strength because they respond by saying, you know what, we're going to be okay. We're going to come back stronger from this and fight back and make sure that everybody knows no one can do this to us. And so there's new kinds of weapons that are introduced, atomic bombs and atomic warfare. And this sets a dangerous precedent for the rest of history. And the use of bombs like that between the United States and Russia, and the use of nuclear weapons to this day, even in places like the Middle East. So it really sets a dangerous precedent going forward. Like I've said, most brutal fighting of the war. There are brutal camps for prisoners of war. If you have not seen the movie Unbroken, I very much um, you know encourage you to see that. It's about a U.S. soldier who finds himself in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, and there he's treated very poorly, tortured, and things like that. But again, gives you appreciation for what they went through. Millions of civilians died on these islands from bombings and just all things like that. So millions die in Japan, and they're really harsh conditions. It's basically a jungle, and the islands are super wet and soggy, and soldiers are wearing wet boots for months at a time, and they're not changing their socks or their clothes or washing them for months at a time. So it's really nasty. There's diseases that are spread from malaria to other things from bugs that are on the island, and it's just a really really tough place to be. And you'll learn more about that in your soldier life video. But that is the Japanese theater. So our next video we'll talk about the effects. But for now we're done, and let me know if you have any questions.